dedicate this year to Kevin's late grandfather, Tzvi ben Betzalel. And Kevin obviously spoke about his grandfather on Thursday night. And there's a lot of trial and tribulation that our grandparents went through that we took for granted. And in South Africa, we grew up on the backs of their hard sweat and their toil and a lot of the sacrifices they made. So we need to be very grateful. On quite a sad note, I'd like to dedicate this year to a friend of mine that passed away during davening on Friday, and the funeral was on Friday. He passed away with his tefillin doing shachrit in Shmona Esrei. It came as a bit of a shock. And Hilly Golombick was obviously he was an incredible human being. You know, there were dozens of Rabbonim from all the communities around, because there's not any community that he wasn't contributing to. He was a mashkiach for very complicated halachic matters. When people were on the conversion program, converting to Judaism, he taught them for many years. He influenced and contributed to thousands of people in our community, and the most incredible human being. And even though he had many difficulties in his life, he extended himself to others in ways that were above and beyond the call of duty. And obviously, we're all going to miss him very, very much. So on that note, we dedicate this year both to Kevin's grandfather as well as Hilly Golombick. And let's just get straight into the Gemara. I'm obviously going to share the chart from the other day, just to give you guys a little bit of a refresher, if you don't mind for a second. Those that are riding in the bus can look. Those that are riding on their bicycles cannot. Okay. So we were talking about the actual damages. As far as Rav is concerned, that belongs to the daughter. But as far as the liability for loss of employment, if the father caused the liability and he hadn't provided financial support for his adult son and daughter, in that case, he would have to pay them immediately. If he did provide support for them, even as adults, he's obviously not liable for their loss of employment because he's sustaining their lifestyle in essence. If it's a minor son, he has to establish trust because his minor son does not have the maturity to be given money and use it wisely. If he's supporting his minor son, he's not liable for the loss of employment because he is, inverted commas, the employer. He's making sure his son's got support. If the daughter is a minor and he doesn't provide any support, let's just say he's he's, for whatever reason, as far as this is concerned, even if he hadn't provided support up until that point, he has to pay for his sustenance of the period needed for her to recover, but he's not liable for the surplus, which a third party would be. In terms of if he is giving his minor daughter financial support, he's looking after her. There's no loss of employment. She's relying on him. As far as the third-party liability for loss of employment, in the first brisa, where the father provides no support, his children, albeit adult children, get payment immediately from the third party. A minor son, there's a trust established. And as far as a minor daughter is concerned, a trust for her sustenance is given, but the father gets the surplus over and above her expenses for food and what she needs to survive. As far as if the father is supporting his children, we learned the second brisa that a father certainly doesn't mind if additional money comes to the minor son or daughter, because if it's a result of them being hurt, he certainly wouldn't want to keep the balance of the money, even if he was supporting them. So the trust is established in that regard. And as far as an adult son or daughter, unfortunately, when we think of the word adult and then son and daughter, we think adult minor. What we're saying is an adult offspring of that parent. The payment is due to them immediately. Okay, so based on that note, the Gemara is asking a question. What do we mean by a trust? In other words, the first brisa ruled that if someone wounds his own minor son, he must set up a trust for the child. The second brisa adds that if one injured someone else's children, he must establish a trust for them. So the Gemara inquires what type of investment of the compensation funds constitute an acceptable trust. So, as far as that's concerned, there's a dispute, as always in the Gemara. The two opinions are as follows. Rav Chisda said, it's a Torah scroll. The assailant should purchase a Torah scroll from which the young victim can study. So why is it considered like a trust? Because if the young victim is not of bar mitzvah age, it's not incumbent upon him to have the mitzvah of learning Torah and lane at that point, etc. So it's set up for him to where he's halachically obligated to do so. However, it's described that in the interim, he still can study from it and accrue mitzvahs as a result. Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, it's a palm tree from which the child can eat dates. So what do we mean? We're talking about a trust is something where you can derive the usufruct or the the produce from the capital investment. You can think of it like a child may be allowed to spend the interest on an investment, but the actual capital amount cannot be depreciated. So why is it used an example of a date tree or a palm tree? Because with the palm tree, if you look at Babylonia, it was a very, very good investment. Everybody used dates, and a palm tree required very little care. So it was a common food source, and therefore it's not a risky venture. What the main thought of it is the principle has to be protected, but the child can have benefit of the interest, the usufruct, the fruit, literally and figuratively with the palm tree. But the assailant, however, is not allowed to invest in the business on behalf of the child because the principle might then be lost. We don't know if the business could be successful. Whereas with the palm tree, it's very straightforward. It produces dates. People buy dates in Babylonia. It's a sure thing. Same as the Torah scroll that you can derive mitzvahs from it. So the Gemara now returns to the question of who receives the compensation for an injury sustained by a minor daughter, because this is set up for a son. So obviously Reish Lakish said the Torah granted the father only the gains of the girl's stage of Narus. So if you remember, there were three stages. There was a minor daughter, which was a katanut, where the father obviously had the majority of control. There was the stage of Narus, where she was a Nara, which means she was 12 years old and had a physical or endocrinological sexual development of at least 2 pubic hairs. And from the age of 12 to 12 and a half, she would stay in that stage at which she was eligible to, I think, meet for possible prospects, etc. And then at 12 and a half, she was considered a legal adult. We discussed why so young. Well, obviously, because people's life expectancy wasn't as long yet in those days. So the minute they hit sexual puberty, they were encouraged to marry and procreate. So at that point, she becomes a 12 and a half with at least 2 pubic hairs, a Bulgarian, a fully fledged adult, but a Nara from the stage of Naras was 12 to 12 and a half with 2 pubic hairs. Obviously, any more sexual development from 12 and a half, as long as she met the minimum criteria, would make her completely independent as an adult. So what do we mean by Reish Lakish saying the girl the father gains the stage of the narus, it means he was eligible to get the dowry money for a prospective husband. So that was number one. And number two, he was entitled to choose the husband for her. If we remember, even if he wasn't very physically attractive, if it was a good shidduch, he had control over that. And the third aspect is he could sell her as a maidservant or a governess, etc., if they obviously financially needed to do so. So he could he doesn't then have to financially support her in that particular manner. So since that's the case, he's got rights of that. So therefore, the Torah, according to Reish Lakish, does not, the father does not receive the payment for her actual injury, her nezek, okay? Which means Reish Lakish agrees with Rav's ruling. Because remember, there was Rav Eliezer and Rav said that the girl receives her payment for the injury, or let's not call her a girl, let's call her a adolescent, a young lady going on the stage towards full adulthood. Obviously, if it's a katanut, there's no question that father has a lot more control. But Rav Yochanan doesn't agree with Reish Lakish nor Rav. He said the father is entitled even to compensation for a wound that she suffered. Okay? So the Gemara doesn't understand this, and it says, does it enter your mind that the father is entitled to compensation for a wound? In other words, guys, we're not talking about a wound that would diminish her value, because if it diminishes her value, that directly affects the father. We're talking about maybe a wound on the girl's back or some other concealed place, which doesn't leave a scar or reduce her value, not to a prospective husband or to an employer. So the Gemara says, listen, if you have a look by that criteria, even Rav Elazar, who obviously is more inclined compared to Rav to award injuries to her father, says only regarding a serious injury, which lessens her value. In other words, according to Rav Elazar, if she lost a limb, since the father has the right to sell the daughter as a maidservant, any diminution of her value is a financial loss for him. That's what it's described at. So it's saying perhaps then even in that case, Rav Yochanan would say that that damage has a direct financial constraint upon the father, because it diminishes the daughter's value. So the Gemara now has to clarify Rav Yochanan's ruling. Rav Yossi Bar Chanina said Rav Yochanan speaks of where the assailant wounded her in her face and lessens her value. The father therefore collects the damage payment. Now, when it discusses this, what's wrong? So are you okay, Gav?
No, I'm just overtired. I had a very bad night last night. I yawned and I'm just tired.
Shame, man.
It's fine. No, I'm not sleeping though. I'm just tired.
Okay. So obviously the Gemara means that in such a case, the assailant would pay the daughter for the normal pain, the healing and humiliation, and would make no payment at all for physical damage, because she didn't suffer any permanent damage. But in a case where it does diminish her value, both Rav Yochanan as well as Rav Elazar is saying that the father does get the money, because he's losing that money that he could sell her as a maidservant. And I'm assuming that it also affects her ability to get the more of a wealthy sort of shidduch if it affects her physical appearance. So even though she didn't lose a limb, her value is diminished. So we're saying in a case where maybe, so why is it talking about a limb? Because a limb means that it affects her ability to work. But if she didn't lose a limb, but she lost her physical looks, then in that case, it might also affect her ability to get a shidduch. Or some people judge it people in a physical manner, and therefore it might even affect her employment. So how does this actually work? Is that now, according to the Gemara's conclusion, basically, let's just get to all the issues at hand. If one injures the adult daughter, or any son of another person. The child, I don't want to use the word child. Kevin had a better word the other day. Can we use the word offspring? Because when I use the word the child or the father, you're thinking I'm talking about a child. So have you got a better word, Gavin?
No, let's just use offspring.
Okay, so fine. So look, in conclusion, if one injures the adult daughter or adult son of another person, the offspring receives all five categories of payment, even if the adult, the young adult, is supported by the father. Why? Because we learned that a parent, when they see their child suffer, even if their child is a young adult and legally an adult, even if he's financially supporting you, he doesn't want to deprive them of added payment because they suffer. Most parents are compassionate of their children. But when a person injures his own adult daughter or adult son, he certainly pays for the damage, the pain, the healing, and humiliation. However, the liability for loss of employment depends. If the father supports his child, even though the child is what you call a legal adult, he needn't pay for the loss of employment because he's entitled to the income because he's being recompensed for providing his support. If the father doesn't support his adult child because they're financially independent, and as a result, they're no longer being able to be employed, obviously he must pay for the loss of employment as well as for other categories if he injures his adult children. But the case of a minor daughter differs because the father has the biblical right to her income and actually is empowered to sell it. So therefore, according to Rav Yochanan, the father receives the entire damage payment for permanent physical damage, okay, when a third party injures the girl, in addition to the loss of employment payment. And he is exempt from making that payment when he injures her as a minor, whether or not he supports her, since her earnings and the ability to sell her belongs to him. Now, not everybody agrees with that opinion. Rav and Reish Lakish are a little bit more egalitarian, and that the father collects only the value of the damage that occurred prior to her to becoming an adult, and payment for any subsequent decrease in value. In other words, it's left permanent scarring as a result of her either being a narus or now she's a case of a bogerish, she's a legal adult, but that still has had a consequence on her. She keeps certain injury payments as far as that's concerned. As far as the loss of employment is concerned, we learned the balance of what happens with a third party based on whether he's providing support or not. Okay. So in other words, just know that Rav said in the beginning, the actual damages belong to the girl itself. There's no question. Okay. And obviously pain, humiliation, and medical bills. So a father's biblical right to his minor daughter's earnings affects the loss of employment payment as follows. If the father doesn't support her and someone else injured her, he receives that portion of the payment over and above what she needs for sustenance, but she still keeps what she needs for sustenance because he's not supporting her. If he himself injured her, he doesn't pay that surplus amount. But if he does support her, we assume that he waives his right to a loss of employment payment when somebody else injures her because it's not costing him anything. But if he injures her, we assume that he doesn't waive that right because he's actually going to have an out-of-pocket loss, especially if he's supporting her. So a minor daughter differs from other children in regard to two categories of physical damage and loss of employment. But regarding the categories of pain, healing, and humiliation, she's basically treated like an adult son or daughter in that regard. Okay? So to review, every child is awarded the payment for pain, healing, and humiliation. When we say the word healing, we mean medical bills, under all circumstances. Every child except a minor daughter is awarded the payment for damage under all circumstances. Okay? In the case of a minor daughter, the father always receives the damage payment But Rav Yochanan argues with Reish Lakish and Rav with regards to his entitlement and whether that extends into adulthood. And that adulthood is from the stage of basically Naros, which is a quasi-adulthood, when she's 12 to 12 and a half with 2 pubic hairs. There's a suffix there. Obviously, when she's a fully fledged adult, there's nothing to talk about. So the loss of employment payment differs from the other 4 because it's equivalent of the child's earnings, okay? So we're looking at several factors here to determine. So it's recipient. The first thing is the type of child injured. Is it a boy or a girl? The second thing is the identity of the assailant. Is it the father or the third party? Or whether or not the father supports the child. And yeah, so that's the case. Do you guys have any questions as far as that's concerned? You're all good. All right. Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, we're good. I think the guys on the buses can't answer. I'm just saying, if they have issues, they can't say anything.
Yeah, that's why I chose this time, because I'm nervous of questions. I'm kidding. I prepared well, but with Hashem's help. Okay, so now we're going to discuss a different issue completely. So we're going to discuss another section of the Mishnah about one who wounds a Canaanite slave of others is liable. Okay, what is he liable to? All 5 categories of payment. Rav Yehuda says slaves are not liable for compensation for humiliation. So again, the Tana Kamma of the Mishnah says a Canaanite slave is entitled to all 5 payments, including humiliation. But Rav Yehuda argues with the Tana Kamma of the Mishnah. Says slaves are not entitled to humiliation. So we want to know, what is Rav Yehuda's reason for exempting the assailant from liability for humiliation? Okay, so the Gemara explains where he gets this from. So the first thing is that if you're going to argue against paying for humiliation, you've got to say, well, what pasuk does humiliation come from? Do any of you guys know? Gavin, since you're the only one that can talk, you put in the hot seat at the moment. And if you weren't feeling well before, this might make you feel a bit more queasy. So where do we establish it from? We've gone through it for ages.
Just, I'm so buggered. You're really asking the wrong guy. I'm sure even with the handicaps that those 2 guys have, you'll get a better answer. What's the question? I'm sure I can answer it. Just
all right. So I'm
just
saying
repeat it.
We've got a pasuk that discusses. I'm not asking you to remember the pasuk. Okay.
No, that I won't.
So it's in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 11, Devarim. What is it? What's this case of humiliation? What's the case set up to talk about? What does it talk about there? That you would remember.
Just give me the context.
Kevin can answer. I think he's bailing you out. Take it. Take the lifeline.
Let him bail me out. What? I didn't hear the part before. That's the part that I'm missing. But if Kevin can bail me out, I'll take it.
He's on mute. I'm trying to unmute him.
I need a lifeline.
Okay, I can't seem to unmute him. All right. So, all right, guys, what happens is there's a pasuk that says, if men shall fight with one another, a man and his brother and the wife of one of them approaches to rescue her husband from the hand of one who is striking him, and she stretches out her hand and grasps his embarrassing place. So the injury then is her humiliating her husband's opponent by grasping his private parts. And we said, well, one of the categories of humiliation is intent to do injury. Obviously intent to humiliate, but the other one is intent to injury. That's where we get it from. So Rav Yochanan is arguing with the Tana Kamma of the Mishnah and saying that the slave isn't entitled to payment for humiliation, because if you look at the pasuk, it says, if men should fight with one another, a man and his brother. Now, the verse basically says, if that's the case, look at the word brother. What does the verse mean? With someone who has the potential for brotherhood with Israelites. So perforce excluding from the law of humiliation is a Canaanite slave who does not have a potential for brotherhood with Israelites. How do we know that? Because a Canaanite slave may not and cannot unite in marriage with an Israelite. It's in Kedushin 68a. So accordingly, he can't achieve brotherhood with Israelites. There's no marriage. So if you're using the pasuk that says, if men shall fight with one another, a man and his brother, that immediately means that you only have to pay a Jew for humiliation when you intend to injure a Jew, not a non-Jew. So that's a pretty good argument that Rav Yehuda has against the Tana Kamma. Do you agree? It's a pretty good argument. So, well, the Gemara now has to explain what the Tana Kamma's ruling is of the Mishnah. So what does the Tana Kamma say? Tana Kamma says, and the rabbis maintain that a slave is an Israelite's brother with respect to certain commandments. Hence, the laws of humiliation are applicable to him as well. So what do we mean? The Tana Kamma is the general anonymous opinion of the rabbis. If we say it's an Israelite's brother, what do you mean according to certain commandments? A Canaanite slave is obligated to perform all mitzvahs incumbent upon a Jewish woman, as derived from a Gezerah Shava. Look in Chagiga 4a. So in the Tana Kamma's opinion, or the general rabbinical opinion, a slave can be viewed as a brother because he shares in common with other Jews an obligation to perform certain mitzvahs. Okay? So that's a pretty good argument. So what does Rav Yehuda say to this? Well, before we get a chance to do that, the Gemara is now going to challenge Rav Yehuda. But now, according to Rav Yehuda, who expounds the word brother to exclude a Canaanite slave, the judges should not kill Zomamim witnesses who testify against a slave. For it is written, with regard to Zomamim witnesses, you shall do to him as he conspired to do to his brother. So, since a slave is not considered a brother, according to Rav Yehuda, the witnesses against him should not be executed. So what is Rav Yehuda saying? So basically, if you've got Adim Zomamim conspiring witnesses, and they succeed in having a slave sentenced to death, and then were found out before the slave is executed that they were conspiring witnesses because they weren't in the same place where they said that they viewed the slave committing a murder, then generally the reciprocal penalty is the conspiring witnesses get the death penalty. And Rav Yehuda says they don't. They shouldn't be subject to the prescribed penalty of receiving the very punishment they intended to pose on their victims. Where's the source? Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 19. And the problem with that is that the law, this is what the Gemara is saying, is that Zomamim witnesses are punished for having testimony against a slave. So Adam Zomamim do get reciprocal punishments. So how can Rav Yehuda say this? Why? Because if you have a look, okay, look in Makos 8b. If an Israelite swears false testimony against a slave, say, for example, for corporal punishment, something, in other words, he wants the slave to get lashed, he gets lashes. Or he gets exiled for his false testimony if he testifies to an inadvertent killing that a slave did. So he does get the reciprocal penalty, a Jew. And it states that in Makos 8b. So how can Rav Yehuda say that? That's what the Gemara says. Because in certain ways he is like a Jew and he has the same halacha as a woman. So Rava's got a good defense of Rav Yehuda. Because Rava said in the name of Rav Sheshes, the end of the self-same verse states, and you shall destroy the evil from your midst. And that indicates that the guilty witnesses are subject to the Zomamim penalty in all circumstances, even when they testify against a slave who is not a brother. So what they're actually saying is that at the end of the day, the reason why the Adam Zomamim penalty applies is because at the end of the day, they're corrupting the justice system. So then you might ask a very good question, is what do you need the pasuk for? You shall do to him as he conspired to do to his brother for Adam Zomamim. Okay? In Deuteronomy chapter 19, verse 19. And the answer comes from Sanhedrin, which Rav Simcha Steinhauer taught us. So say, for example, you've got a case of adultery with a bas Kohen. Bas Kohen that commits adultery is subject to being burnt. She gets burnt. Okay? And the man that she committed adultery with gets the death penalty that is subject for adultery, which is not as hectic as burning. And we learn what sort of Adam Zomamim, what punishment do they get? Do they get the punishment, the more severe penalty, which is getting her burnt? Because that's what they try to do to her, that's for sure. Or do they get the lesser penalty, what they try to do to him? In other words, his punishment for adultery. Which punishment do we apply? And that's exactly why we have the verse, what they try to do to their brother is done to them. So we learn that they don't get burnt as a bas Kohen. They actually get the death penalty that they intended to do to their brother. Does that make sense, guys?
Mm.
So that's what we learned from Rav Simcha Steinhauer. So I thought that was quite interesting. So that's what we learned from it. So, yeah. So, I thought, yeah, so I thought, look, we can carry, let me just see how much time we've got. We've got 4 minutes. Let me just see something and see how far we are. Yeah, I think, I think we can finish off on that particular 19 cents of the Gemara. Yeah.
Can you just go over that point again, please? I'll go back into mute about this, the same punishment as the brother.
Yeah. Okay, so you're asking. So listen, what happened is as follows: is that we were saying, as far as this is concerned, that Rav Yehuda is saying that a slave isn't paid for humiliation. Okay, because he uses the term that if you look at the pasuk in Deuteronomy chapter 25 verses 11, talks about men that are fighting with one another and a man and his brother. So a brother is a fellow Jew. So he was saying then that we get the pasuk of embarrassment because the wife grabs her husband's opponent by his privates and injures him, and therefore the payment that is due to him is for humiliation. So therefore, when it talks about a man and his brother quarreling, it means his fellow Jew, which excludes a slave from the payment of humiliation, because that's where we get the payment for humiliation from that pasuk. But the Gemara is saying, well, how would the Tana Kamma explain it? And he was saying that, look, an Israelite's brother, well, firstly, Rav Yehuda was saying definitely a Canaanite slave doesn't have a potential for brotherhood with Israelites. Why? Because a Canaanite slave may not marry a Israelite. Therefore, he can't achieve the brotherhood. So then the Gemara asked the Tana Kamma of the Mishnah, well, what do you say? And the rabbis say that with respect to an Israelite's brother, certain commandments are applicable to them. They have to have bris milah, they've got to go in a mikveh, they've got to do, they cannot do any negative commandments. All commandments incumbent upon a woman are incumbent upon a Canaanite slave. So in that way, they're entitled to payments for humiliation. Okay? Then the argument goes, but then what would Rav Yehuda say? Because Rav Yehuda says that if you look at Adam Zomamim, if you testify against a slave, you don't get the reciprocal penalty. You shouldn't, because the verse says, you shall do to him as he conspired to do to his brother. And a Canaanite slave is not your Jewish brother. But yet, the Gemara says we treat Adam Zomamim and we punish them with the same reciprocal penalty they're trying to do to to a slave. So, which means the Gemara doesn't see it Rav Yehuda's way. So Rav Yehuda has got a defense, and that defense comes from Rav, who said in the name of Rav Sheshes that the verse says, and you shall destroy the evil from your midst, meaning that we don't want to have a corrupt law system. So that's why they maintain Adam Zumimim, even against the slave, is not halachically like your brother. Okay? So all I said is, Rav Simcha Steinhauer, where do we learn this thing from your brother? In the case of witnesses against adultery, what they intended to do to this man and this woman of a Bas Kohen, we don't burn the Adam Zomimim like we do with a Bas Kohen if they found a Bas Kohen, if they found out to be Adam Zomimim. We give the same death penalty as his brother, as what they intended to do to the man, which isn't as hectic, but they still get the death penalty. That's all I was saying. Guys, we're going to run out of time. I wish you a wonderful week. Kevin, I wish you long life. I really do.
Yeah. From me too, Kevin.
All right.